I just want to introduce ACEMV. We are a nonprofit that was founded in 2008. We're adult and continuing education on Martha's Vineyard, and we serve Vineyard residents with educational opportunities that otherwise they can't access being here on the island. So we provide certificates, licenses, CEUs, PDPs, even undergraduate and graduate degrees through our partnerships with off-island colleges and universities. And we support training and education in business and healthcare and entrepreneurship and trades across the island, education for teachers and educator training, and renewable energy, as well as literacy and enrichment for everyone. So we have a wide range of offerings, and we try to keep all of our courses accessible and affordable, and we hope that you will consider donating to us to support our services for Martha's Vineyard. So I am very happy to introduce our next guest, Richard Walker. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can get you up here, Richard. I had the pleasure of having coffee with Richard recently, late summer, early fall, and just really enjoyed getting to know a little bit about you, and hoping that you can introduce yourself and tell us about your work, and that we can get into the topic of the Working Cities Challenge, and especially poverty in cities. And it's a different topic than Martha's Vineyard is used to talking about because we're so rural. But we know that the effects extend across county lines, and looking forward to hearing your perspective and your history and your expertise on the subject. So thank you for being with us, Richard.
Well, thank you, Holly, for that kind introduction. And I also want to thank my friend Nancy Hoffman for her role in my involvement here today. My family's history on Martha's Vineyard goes back over 70 years when my parents, Richard and Helen Walker, first came to the vineyard for their honeymoon. Family history says that after the honeymoon, my mother told my father, "We're buying a house here." And of course they did. A year or so after that, I was born, took my first steps as a child on the island, and in fact spent every summer here for the time I started walking until I was in my third year of graduate school. I washed dishes and learned to cook professionally at Giordano's restaurant in Oak Bluffs, and most recently I was on the board of the Martha's Vineyard Museum as we completed the capital campaign, finished construction, and opened the new museum. All to say that, like all of you, Martha's Vineyard holds a very special place in my heart. I've been asked to talk about a project that I was instrumental in creating and leading for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston called the Working Cities Challenge. But to adequately describe the creation of the initiative, I need to step back a little in time. In 2007, we were entering the Great Recession. Eric Rosengren had just been named president of the bank. And as you might imagine, these were really hectic times for the whole Federal Reserve System because of the financial beating the economy and the general public were taking at the time. Eric moved swiftly to meet with every officer of the bank shortly after it was announced by the board of directors that he was to take over. I distinctly remember his conversation with me. He wanted the bank to play a more significant and direct role in impacting low and moderate income communities in the district, and that it was our job to take the risk to make that happen. He also assured me that he would have my back. I mention this because it's exactly the kind of bold leadership that runs through the development and the success of Working Cities. Working Cities started with a realization that the previous economic upturn that preceded the Great Recession had left out a set of smaller industrial cities in New England. Cities like Worcester, Springfield, Hartford, New Haven, Lowell, Lawrence, Waterbury as examples. But there were also a host of other cities throughout the Northeast, Midwest, and Upper South that were also experiencing these same issues, and I'll talk about that later. My department, the Community Development Department, along with the Research Department, embarked on a set of research projects to see if we could get a better understanding of what was going on in these smaller industrial cities. We chose Springfield as our focus for our initial research. Springfield at the time had the three lowest income census tracts in the Commonwealth. The foundational paper we published was entitled Invigorating Springfield, Lessons from Resurgent Cities, that we published in 2009. The primary authors of those papers were Yolanda Kajitsky and Ana Patricia Munoz, with several other contributing authors, including myself. This was a comparative analysis of 25 other similarly situated cities by population and percentage of manufacturing dating back to the 1960s. And those cities were primarily in the East, Northeast, the Midwest, and the Upper South. It compared those cities based on a host of demographic and economic statistics like educational attainment, poverty rate, household family income, et cetera, et cetera. What the research showed us was that Springfield was at or near the top of those statistical categories we were looking at back in 1960s, but Springfield was at or near the bottom of almost all those statistical categories we looked at in 2008. However, the statistical data alone didn't tell us the whole story, as there were a group of 8 cities in our study that were doing significantly better than the peer group. So we started to look at qualitative data, newspapers, magazine articles, journals, anything that we could do to better identify what was going on in those communities. The hope was that if we could find out why those cities were doing better, we might be able to help those who weren't doing so well achieve better results. Reviewing the data, it showed that it wasn't normal economic indicators, for example, close proximity to a major transportation hub. It wasn't spillover effects from being close to a larger metropolitan area. And it wasn't industry mix that was creating the improvement. The key variable in those cities that were doing better was good civic leadership. Precisely put, a cross-sector leadership group had come together, created a vision for where they wanted their city to go. They often formed a nonprofit organization and hired professional management staff to manage their effort. They marshaled the existing resources in their community to carry out those objectives, and they held each other accountable through data-driven assessment of how they were progressing on meeting their goals. Remember this point because it'll come up again and again in my talk. While the findings surprised some of the economists, it wasn't a total surprise to me. For a number of years, I had been participating in a cross-sector leadership group on behalf of the bank that had been originated by Dr. Huey Jones, Professor Emeritus at the BU School of Social Work, Dr. Sherry Penny, President of UMass Boston, Mayor Tom Menino, and the head of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. We had been formed as a group to confront the lingering scars from the confrontations over busing in the city in the late 70s and early 80s. We had been traveling for years to other cities, first in this country and then around the world, to learn how we might make Boston better. One of the results of that effort was the formation of the Boston's Children's Chorus. But getting back to working cities, we presented the data from our study to a group of community and business leaders in Springfield, which developed an interest and eventual financial support from the United Way of Springfield to form a cross-sector collaborative leadership group. We identified a group of small cities in the study that the group wanted to visit, and the Fed did the background research in each of those cities to identify what were the key organizations and who were the key leaders in each of those cities that we wanted to speak to so we could get the true story of what happened in each of those cities. The Fed also set up the itinerary, handled logistics for those trips. And Springfield City to City decided it wanted to hit two birds with one stone by traveling to Winston-Salem and Greensboro, North Carolina, which were only 50 miles from each other. So we could cover both cities within 3 days. Importantly, Fed President Eric Rosengren decided to join the group for the first day and a half in Winston-Salem. In Winston-Salem, we met with the mayor, the head of the Winston-Salem Community Foundation, president of the Chamber of Commerce, the executive director of Arts Winston-Salem, head of the Public Housing Authority, representatives from the Wake Forest Medical School, the superintendent of Winston-Salem Public Schools, and the executive director of the local community foundation. Our meeting with the mayor set the stage for what was an uncanny visit that President Rosengren described as interviewing the Stepford Wives, if any of you remember that sci-fi movie. The mayor described the city's situation as being so dire that they were 2 steps from the guillotine at that point. And the only thing that saved them was the effort initiated and funded by the community foundations to bring a cross-sector collaborative leadership group together to try and turn things around. I should stop here and make a point that all of the 25 cities that we looked at, and probably many others, had all suffered from the deindustrialization that had occurred, first moving industries from New England South, and then from much of the US to offshore places such as China, Vietnam, India, and others. Let's see. The leadership group in Winston-Salem created a vision for where they wanted their city to go. They expanded that leadership group in the city. They marshaled the existing resources. They formed a nonprofit organization and hired professional staff to help manage the effort. They collected data to measure their progress on meeting their goals and holding each other accountable for their roles in contributing to the success of the effort. Remember what I described earlier in our research? What was Stepford wife-like about the interviews was each of the leaders, to a one, recited the visions, the goals, and their responsibilities as leaders almost verbatim. In fact, the last interview with the executive director of the local community development corporation, who was an African-American woman originally from Springfield, Massachusetts. And I asked her point blank, how is it that every leader had spoken and repeated exactly the same vision that the mayor had said to us? And she said, we're all drinking from the same pitcher of iced tea. True Southern hospitality. A short time after returning from our trip, we presented our findings to the mayor of Springfield. However, much to our dismay, he took the results of our research and our leadership visits as a critique of his own personal leadership style. This meant we had to go back to the drawing board on how to create a strategy to help the other smaller cities in New England. We had been discussing all along with our community colleagues, community development colleagues from the other Reserve Bank staffs in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and Cleveland about our smaller industrial cities focus. At an annual community development conference in Philadelphia, we decided to form a Fed interest group on this topic of smaller industrial cities. We were also having discussions with National Philanthropy, specifically the Ford Foundation and Living Cities. Living Cities is a consortium of the largest private, bank, and corporate foundations in the US that jointly have a specific interest in funding affected urban areas. Our initial discussions were problematic with the foundations because whenever we would broach the subject of these smaller cities, they would always come back to us with one of their primary constraints, which was to fund initiatives whose impact could reach a level of significant scale. Nevertheless, Living Cities continued an ongoing discussion with us. What was intriguing to us about Living Cities was they were operating a funding project called the Integration Initiative for larger cities, including Newark, Baltimore, and Cleveland, that incorporated many of the elements that we had identified in our research and city-to-city visits. What we subsequently learned was that the Integration Initiative strategy in those cities was based on a strategy that had been developed by an educational partnership project in Cincinnati called STRIVE. The elements of that program had been written up in the Stanford Social Innovations Review by John Kania and Mark Kramer, researchers over at Harvard, and called Collective Impact. We actually invited John Kania over for lunch to talk about his research. And what were the elements of collective impact? A common agenda, shared vision, shared measurement, a system of data collection to measure results, mutually reinforcing activities that the efforts of one partner would be able to build upon the efforts of others. Continuous communication, the ability to give regular feedback to identify problems and make adjustments or changes in direction and to build trust. A backbone organization which to provide skill management and staff to coordinate participation of organizations and agencies, support alignment of activities, and build public will and mobilize funding. As you will note, these significantly overlap what we identified both in our original research and what we had discovered in our city-to-city visits. As a result of an internal brainstorming session, we identified the following things that we needed to do to move the effort forward. We had to create our own model for funding smaller industrial cities in New England by addressing the issue of scale raised by the national funders. And we had to address the desire by some local leaders, read mayors, to try and control the local efforts. Second, we had to build the cross-sector collaborative leadership example by creating a funding collaborative of national funders, the state government, and the private sector, with in-kind contributions from the Boston Fed. And we, the Boston Fed, had to become the backbone organization for the initiative in the 6 New England states, providing skilled management, staff, and coordinating participation in organizations and agencies. We addressed the issue of scale by pointing out to Living Cities and eventually to other national funders like Kresge and Doris Duke that funding a significant portion of smaller cities at the same time constituted a level of scale and potential impact that they sought. For example, addressing the issue of poverty in 5 or 6 of Massachusetts' cities would direct itself at least almost half of the poverty in the state of Massachusetts. Even further, we were planning to run projects in all 6 New England states, having either further impact and of scale. To address the potential issue with mayors, we decided to make it a funding competition that had to be awarded to a cross-sector collaborative leadership group and required that the backbone organization in those cities that the funds would flow to in the city had to be a nonprofit organization that all parties in the city's efforts supported. Our discussions with Living Cities finally paid off and culminated with Ben Heck, then president of Living Cities, visit to Boston to meet with President Resurgent and a commitment from them to provide a third of the funding for Massachusetts. On the private sector side, we were in discussions with a mass competitive partnership, which were the CEOs of the largest 26 corporations in Massachusetts. That group had a history of jointly funding community improvement projects brought to it by its members. It just so happened that several of their members were on our board, and then one of our current board members had just rolled off their board, which helped pave the way for their participation. Also during that period, I was meeting with the Secretary of Economic Development from the state on and off, keeping him abreast of our research, our discussion with national funders about funding a Massachusetts effort. Letting him know we were structuring a cross-sector funding pool and would need the state's participation. Also during that period, President Resurgent met with the governor, the Speaker of the House, and the Senate to build support for the state contributions to the funding effort. It took a little time and things were a little intense because none of the funders wanted to jump in the pool first. But eventually Living Cities committed $800,000 over 3 years, quickly followed up by the state's commitment and eventually the competitive partnership. And we ended up raising $2.7 million for the first round of the Massachusetts competition. The funding strategy proved key because it allowed all the parties to leverage their dollars with the funds from the others that the others were contributing. But as it turns out, the individual grant winners in round one leveraged funding even further for an additional $8.4 million of funds that went to their individual projects. That's, in my mind, a great success. We followed the second round in Massachusetts. We followed with a second round in Massachusetts and then eventually expanded to Rhode Island, Connecticut, and are now holding competitions in Vermont and Maine. Further, the Dallas Fed is running a variation of our model and hired one of our staff to run that effort in Texas. Other important elements of the competition. We formed a cross-sector advisory committee to the initiative, which had representatives from the funders, all the sectors, and involved as well independent professionals and academics involved in community development to give ongoing advice, feedback, and support to the effort. We also hired an outside evaluation team, Cambridge Associates, to assess the effectiveness of the delivery and the impact of the initiative. And finally, we also developed an independent and impartial jury that did not include the Fed in this to make the decisions about which communities got funded. The role of the Fed was as the backbone organization for the initiative, providing management, staffing, technical assistance, as well as contracting for training for the winning cities with state-based consultants on such topics as how to collect and use data, how to develop outreach strategies, how to run meetings, how to create social chains. And the Fed also contributed in-kind costs to the network meetings, steering committees, and events. Before I pivot to the topic of social change, I thought I'd give a brief description of how Working Cities competition process worked. The competition was designed for cities that had the deepest financial challenges, highest rates of unemployment, lowest income census tracts, lowest academically performing schools, et cetera, et cetera. When we sent out the RFP, we set out a list of those eligible cities. As I mentioned earlier, the applications had to be submitted by a cross-sector leadership group and have a designated nonprofit organization that could receive the funds. There could only be one application per city, which may seem to go without saying, but in the first round, we had several cities that had competing groups within the city that wanted to submit applications. Despite our best effort, we even had one city that submitted 2 applications, which automatically eliminated them. The proposed projects in the could be of any type of community development purpose: housing, education, community health, community safety, workforce development. It didn't matter to us. What mattered is that the community came together and chose which one they wanted to focus on. But even more importantly, the proposed project had to target and benefit the low-income residents of that community, and also address in the submission issues of racial equity. Excuse me, let me just grab a drink here. System change. My comments on this are going to focus primarily on what we uncovered about system change as we move through the Working Cities Challenge. Oops, what did I do? Seem to have missed a page here somewhere. Bear with me for a second. Oh, here we are. Okay. So what are we talking about? What is a system? Well, there are all kinds of systems: solar system, water systems, transportation systems. But we're referring specifically to social systems. That is, systems that have to do with group interaction with and among people. The father of the term social system was the great sociologist Talcott Parsons, who defined social systems as a network of interactions between actors which relies on a system of language and culture and exists in a society. Not very helpful for our purposes. How about some examples? Well, nuclear families are systems. Communities are systems. Cities are systems. Nations, college campuses, corporations, and industries are all examples of social systems. And as you may have already deduced, we all belong to or are part of many systems. What is system change? We define system change as about changing the conditions holding the problems in place in communities. So what are the conditions that do that? Well, what we've discovered is that there are many levels of conditions, and those conditions are visible, they're invisible, and they're semi-visible. And what do I mean by that? Visible conditions are things like public policy, rules and practices, and resource flows. They're the things that you can identify through budgets, through laws and regulations, but they also are the things that need to change in the end in order to make system change work. Then there are the semi-visible elements of the conditions. Those elements are not readily visible, but are discoverable with a little inquiry. Those include relationships and connections, the power dynamics and equity in the local system. And finally, on the bottom, or what is invisible in your local communities, are mental models and narratives. How many times have you said to yourself or others, it's the powers that be that stopped our ability to get a park cleaned or a recreational center built? Or perhaps you said, well, it's the old boy network that's blocking our getting funding for that women's clinic. Or one I'm sure we've all said, you can't fight City Hall. Those are mental models. Those are narratives that we have that keep us from being able to make the change that we need. And addressing those visible and invisible leverage points make changing the visible ones, that is policy, rules, regulations, and budgets, much easier to move. In working cities, we learn the following. Policy change is critical to system, is a critical lever to system change. If you can't change those, you can't change policies that are breaking or blocking the communication and flow, then you're going to really have a very difficult time in making system change. However, you need to be mindful of the within and without. Don't always look to change outside conditions. Also find ways to change conditions within an organization or within your collective team or group. Organizations can change policy, practitioner programs, or mental models in their own organizations that can help make it move more positively. Make it chunky, which is to say, right size your approach. System change can seem insurmountable. Find ways to break it down. Assess system change targets along a hard, easy access and a low impact, high impact access so that you can understand what are short and what are long-term objectives. Find your allies. Don't underestimate individual influence to affect larger social systems, especially in smaller communities and rural areas. You need to find allies to do the system work that can change policy and practice. That's why cross-sector collaborative leadership is so important, because you start with a group of people who are used to collaborating, and you can bring others into the process as you move along. Look like a program, act like a system. System change framing can be insider focused and not easily accessible to your partners. Find ways for your partners and allies who are not in your inner circle to see themselves in your work by showing off or touting your program's success while making sure the program links to the largest system. In summation, system change is hard, it's complex, it's imperfect, it's a long-term game. I've been traveling with a group of funders prior to my leaving the Fed, where we traveled across the country visiting these smaller industrial cities. And even the ones that were most successful, it took 10 years at a minimum to see significant change. But you need to think about making sure you identify some short-term successes to keep the effort going. And you need to celebrate those successes in order to keep the momentum going. So despite the fact it's long-term, you need to celebrate those tiny elements of success as you move along the process. System change is uncomfortable, it's subtle, but it's people's work. Working Cities' challenge is creating a vehicle and an effective cross-sector leadership group and the tools the community needs for systems change. I leave you with a South African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Cross-sector collaborative leadership will get you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So we have time for a Q&A. If people just want to unmute yourselves and jump in, please do, or you can enter a question in the chat box. I have a question. Earlier in the very beginning of your talk, you said, there was one criteria that really stood out as the most important, and that was strong civic leadership. And I'm curious if you found that it made a difference that local civic leadership that was engaged and involved was also reflective of minorities or a variety of people in their communities.
Absolutely. I think I also mentioned that most of those groups that formed also made it a point to very early on bring others in. And in no situation that I can think of the cities that I've been to, where there wasn't an effort to make sure minorities and others were included as part of the process. The one I can think of possibly was started and run by the Chamber of Commerce. They were effective, but you could feel it in the community that it didn't have the same intensity. It didn't have the same feel in the city that everybody was part and rowing in the same direction.
Didn't have the buy-in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to open it up to other questions. I have several questions, but I want to make sure that other people can jump in and ask too. So if you want to unmute yourself, please do, and just jump right in. Well, in the meantime, I will ask, so you're familiar with Martha's Vineyard, you're a native, you've been here plenty. So I know that you're familiar with the government systems that we have. We've got the county, Dukes County, we've got 6 towns, independent towns, and we've got the Wampanoag Tribal Nation. So we have lots of government here. And there's an effort underfoot to regionalize and consolidate and remove some barriers from working together as an island and one large community. And I'm wondering, in your work with Springfield and some of these other smaller communities that have tentacles out into the regions around them, what you think about the efforts that are happening here for Martha's Vineyard and any insights you have.
Well, I often, one of the things I served as a volunteer was as chair of the Metropolitan Area Regional Planning Council, as the chair of the council at one point. So I'm very familiar with the benefits of regional planning, particularly for the 101 cities that surround Boston, including Boston. So I tend to be a supporter of those kinds of efforts. My sense is, given my knowledge and history of Martha's Vineyard, it is that it would benefit greatly from more cross-sector, meaning those various organizations you outlined, involvement in joint planning efforts for the whole island. It does not make sense to me, and I'm sure this may bring up old ghosts, that we have 3 separate sewer systems serving each of the towns, when in my mind there should have been one central system that served the whole island, or at least a major portion of it. It would have been cheaper. It wouldn't have cost as much, but unfortunately that boat has sailed. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but
Definitely. I know we could have a whole conference just on that regionally. But it just strikes me that, so many towns off island, they don't have the geographic boundaries that we have on the island. They can partner with towns further away, closer, and that many of them do. I've learned that a lot of towns in Western Mass are partnering with each other. They've got these regional collaborations, multi-town collaborations to share services, to share transportation services, medical services. And yeah, so it's a big issue here on the island. And it reflects a lot of what you're talking about, because you're working with these bigger cities and we're very rural with these very small towns, but we face a lot of the same issues.
same issues, same issues. I mean, even during the time that I was chair of MAPC, we formed the Mayor's Coalition in this region, so that so the cities could do purchasing together and save themselves a great deal of money on purchasing ambulances and fire trucks and a whole host of things that all the cities need. And it was much cheaper for them to do that purchasing together.
Other questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead, Paul.
Okay. So with the regional planning, I was wondering, who are the people I'm going to want to talk to about that, like for my region in general?
Well, let's see. I mean, it's been a while since I was on the council. I mean, I would just suggest that, I mean, you can easily Google the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And if you can't find that, then have Holly get back to me, and I'll get you the information and the people you should contact.
All right. Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks.
Other questions? All right, well, thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you for having me, Holly. I really enjoyed it. And you guys, everybody have a great day.
You too, and thanks for your time. And I hope to see you again here on the Vineyard. Thank you. And for everyone else, and you, Richard, please stay on if you'd like. We're going to move to our next speaker for the One Day University in about 12 minutes. At 2 o'clock, we're going to welcome Joshua Dodds from UMass Amherst, talking about issues of race, diversity, and oppression. So thank you all for being with us. Again, this is sponsored by ASIMV, Adult and Continuing Education of Martha's Vineyard. And I'm going to put mine on mute now and do a little screen share, and we can all take a break and reconvene at 2 o'clock. So thank you.